They say a person's true self only shows at 30,000 feet, when the sky is endless and the air is too thin for pretenses to survive. I didn't believe that, until the day I watched a stranger's eyes flicker with panic and contempt in the same breath. It was the kind of moment you don't expect to remember for the rest of your life, but somehow, it branded itself onto mine. That's what brings me here, telling you this story from row 2, seat B, waiting for the engines to carry us past the point of no return. If you've ever felt the sting of being underestimated, where you've watched justice unfold in real time, hit that like button and subscribe, because you'll understand exactly why what happened on this flight still feels like a wound stitched together with irony. The morning had started with the kind of sharp autumn light that makes glass and steel in the city shimmer like something out of a painting. My Uber driver hummed softly to himself the entire ride to the airport, tapping the steering wheel in rhythm, and I'd looked out the window, rehearsing nothing in particular, just breathing through the familiar travel checklist in my head. Boarding pass, ID, stethoscope tucked neatly in my carry-on, the letter from the board confirming my keynote speech in London. I remember thinking how ordinary the day felt, how quietly, invisibly happy I was. That changed the moment I stepped onto the jet bridge. The air inside the aircraft was just a little too warm, clinging to my skin as I entered the cabin. My seat, 2B, was just ahead, first class, next to a small window that caught shards of sunlight. I had just begun to settle in when a shadow fell across me. "Ma'am," came the voice. Soft at first, but dipped in a tone practiced enough to slice right through politeness. I glanced up, and the flight attendant stood rigid, clipboard hugged to her chest, eyes flicking down at my jeans and cardigan before she even thought to glance at the slip of paper in my hand. "This section is for first-class passengers only," she said in the kind of way that isn't a request but a verdict already delivered. Around us, the murmur of boarding chatter softened. I felt eyes, dozens of them, tilt toward me. Someone's phone camera tilted too. Without speaking, I extended my boarding pass. Her brow tightened slightly, as if she were holding back something, a sigh, an apology she had no intention of giving, before she read the seat number. There must be a mistake," she muttered. My mind clicked through the usual calculus. How much would I sacrifice here? My dignity versus my peace. The elderly man in seat 2A, white hair neatly combed, leaned forward with the weathered impatience of someone used to being obeyed. "Maybe you should just take whatever they give you, miss. Probably easier." His voice was pitched for me to hear, but soft enough to make it sound like advice instead of an order. I smiled faintly, because sometimes a smile is the only armor available, and said, "There's no mistake. I'm in 2B. She didn't respond, just scribbled something quickly on her sheet and disappeared toward the galley. I could feel the temperature in the cabin shift again, not physically, but atmospherically, the way curiosity warps the air when people are waiting to see if something becomes a scene. I looked out the window to avoid their eyes. My reflection ghosted over the tarmac below. In that fractured mirror of glass and daylight, I saw not myself, but the years behind me. The nights on call at the hospital, the surgeries that stretched into sunrise, the tiny notes of gratitude written by patients who would never know how close to the brink they'd been. I chose medicine because lives mattered more than persections, but in moments like this, persections tried hard to matter more than lives. The thud of luggage in the overhead bins, laughter from row 3, a child's muffled question about snacks. It all layered together until it was impossible to tell whether the hum in my ears was the aircraft powering up or the slow build of anger pressing on my ribcage. I leaned my head back, willing the engines to start. What I didn't know, what no one could have known, was that by the time we touched down, everything about this flight, about this crowd, even about that flight attendant, would have shifted. And it wouldn't be because of an argument over a seat. It would be because high above the ocean, someone's life would hang in balance, and the only person between him and death would be the woman they were so sure didn't belong here. But in that moment, locked in the stillness of boarding, I only knew the quiet, and the quiet knew me back. I had just begun to drift into that strange half-sleep you get on planes, a hovering weightlessness between awareness and forgetting, when the first jolt hit. It wasn't severe turbulence, just a sudden dip and shudder that made the metal around us groan. I heard the soft clink of ice and glasses, the rustle of magazines being lifted, but then came something different, a sound sharp enough to slice through the low roar of the engines. A muffled gasp. A woman's voice, quivering, hurried, "Henry? Henry? Talk to me, please." I turned my head, and there in 1A, the neatly combed elderly man from boarding was slumped sideways, eyes wide but unfocused, his lips tinged with blue. His wife was gripping his arm like she could anchor him to the seat by sheer will. The flight attendant appeared instantly, her voice pitched into that brittle professionalism that only shows up in emergencies. "Is there a doctor on board?" The words rang out, and for a second, no one moved. It's always like that. Those few frozen heartbeats where the weight of the request presses down on the cabin. Then I unbuckled, the seatbelt snapping back with a metallic sting. "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon," I said, already moving into the narrow aisle. "No time for questions. We need him lying flat, now." My voice was sharper than I intended, but urgency doesn't have patience for politeness. The attendant hesitated only a moment before helping me ease him to the floor. Passengers shrank back into their seats, knees pulled in, eyes following every movement. My hands found his wrist, weak pulse, erratic rhythm. His breath came in shallow bursts, each one more distant than the last. I pivoted to the attendant. "Do you have oxygen on board?" "And a medical kit with aspirin, nitroglycerin, anything for cardiac distress." She blinked, nodding rapidly, then hurried toward the galley. I spoke to his wife without looking away from him, my tone grounding, steady. "Has he been diagnosed with heart problems before?" Her answer tumbled out between sobs. "Triple bypass, 5 years ago. On medication, no incidents since." The kid arrived, and I slid a small oxygen mask over his face, the hiss of airflow threading into our tight circle. I slipped off my cardigan. It was suddenly far too warm, and began assessing, recalibrating my plan with each minute change in his color and pulse. I could feel the vibration of the engines through the floor beneath my knees, the faint swaying of the cabin as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Somewhere behind me, a child whimpered. Someone whispered, "That's the woman they didn't want up here earlier." I pushed every other voice out. It was just him and me now, the narrowing of his airway, the stubborn thud of his heart trying to right itself, the way his fingers twitched against the carpet before going still. "Stay with me, Henry," I murmured, a mantra more for the living than the dying. 1 milligram of nitroglycerin under his tongue, oxygen flow adjusted, a firm press at a pressure point to encourage better circulation. Small actions that, strung together, might be the difference between survival and silence. And then a shift. His chest rose deeper this time, the tiniest flush returning to his cheeks, his eyelids fluttering under the faint yellow cabin light. The worst had passed for now, but I didn't let go of his wrist. Not yet. The hum of the engines slowly reclaimed the cabin, steady and unbroken, as if the sky itself wanted to smooth over the jagged edges of what had just happened. Henry's breathing had steadied into gentle, rhythmic waves. The shallow, desperate gasps from minutes ago were gone, replaced with a warmth returning to his face that made his wife lean forward like she couldn't believe it was real. I stayed crouched beside him longer than necessary, my hand still wrapped around his wrist, counting beats until they became something that spoke of endurance instead of fragility. My knees ached from the hard carpet, and my hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the fading rush of adrenaline, that shimmering, electric residue that always follows a moment where life could have tipped the wrong way. When I finally leaned back, the air around us felt different. That prickly, fragile bubble that forms during a crisis, where the rest of the world holds its breath, had begun to dissolve. It was being replaced with something else. Awe, gratitude, and an almost uncomfortable quiet. You could hear small sounds again. The faint hum of overhead vents, the plastic click of someone resetting their seatbelt, the metallic clink of a coffee pot being set down in the galley. But layered over all of it was that subtle, unblinking energy of people who had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. The flight attendant was still standing there several paces away, the clipboard drooping against her thigh. Her eyes locked on me as though she had forgotten there was an entire cabin to tend to. When our eyes met, her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but wasn't quite ready to arrange the right words. She approached slowly, her usually brisk, unobtrusive steps replaced with something heavier. "Dr. Clark," she began, her voice no longer clipped or formal, but softened, human. "I thank you." There was more in those two syllables than simple gratitude. Regret threaded through them, though she didn't name it. Some apologies come with a bow, some with tears. Hers was in the trembling of her voice and the brief break in her gaze. But I let it pass without ceremony. I shifted my attention back to Henry, repositioning his oxygen mask gently before nodding toward his wife. He's stable now, but he needs monitoring as soon as we land. Ask the captain to arrange for medics at the gate. My voice was calm, professional, as though the rest of the scene, the doubts, the assumptions, hadn't even existed. That was my privilege as the one who had done the saving. I got to decide whether or not to acknowledge the rest. As I rose and stepped into the aisle, passengers adjusted themselves to make room, but the movement was different than before. No longer the subtle recoil people give when they want to avoid contact, but a parting with intention, like a quiet acknowledgement of space earned. The narrow walkway back to my seat seemed longer, and yet every step was made heavier by the eyes that followed me. A man in 3C met my gaze and nodded deeply, his lips pressed together in a way that needed no words. A woman across the aisle whispered, "Thank you." The moment I reached her row, her voice catching on the U like the weight of the moment had just hit her. Somewhere near the rear of the cabin, the applause began, tentative at first, as though the very idea of clapping mid-flight felt foreign. It spread fast, rippling up toward the nose of the plane until the sound filled the pressurized air itself. I lowered myself back into 2B slowly, my seat creaking as if it too felt the change. For the first time since boarding, I let my shoulders drop against the headrest. I could still feel the gaze of the man in 2A, the same man who had earlier suggested I take whatever they give you. His tone now was lower, stripped clean of its earlier casual authority. "Doctor," he said, the single word resting between us like something fragile. I was wrong. There was no smugness in his voice, only quiet recognition. I didn't offer him absolution, because some truths don't need to be softened. I simply nodded lightly and turned my face toward the window. The clouds outside had thinned, sunlight pouring through in fractured gold, skating in sharp angles across the silver sweep of the wing. I thought about the strange, compact world of an airplane, how it traps you in a metal cylinder with strangers, and how quickly power dynamics can take shape before anyone has even buckled in. One look, one assumption, and your place in that hierarchy feels set. But then life, in its unpredictable, impatient way, shuffles the deck. And sometimes it's given to you, the chance to turn dismissal into necessity, invisibility into command, without you even asking for it. For me, this was just another page in the long catalog of moments where I've had to prove, without warning, who I am and what I can do. For others here, I suspected, this was something deeper, an uncomfortable awareness that they had seen themselves in the hesitation, the doubt, the narrowing of possibility based purely on appearance. That knowledge wasn't my burden to carry for them. The sky outside stretched endlessly, a yawning blue horizon unbroken ahead. I exhaled, feeling my pulse finally align again with the steady vibration of the aircraft. I hadn't needed to say a word to change their minds. The work had spoken for itself. But the irony still lingered like the aftertaste of strong coffee. How quickly they'd asked me to prove I belonged here, and how decisively fate had answered for me. Above the ocean, thousands of miles from the ground, they had learned the kind of lesson you don't forget. And I had simply done my job.